They may just be the most poemy of poems, so let's talk about sonnets. The sonnet might just be the form that looms over the shoulder of nearly every poet. Love 'em or hate 'em, they're a major part of English poetry, and that's especially fun since the poet didn't originate in English, which is something we'll get into more as we talk about it. Really, the agenda for today is to show you how sonnets work, to talk about a few of the major variations you'll run into, and then at the end, show you a steep challenge for the sturdiest of sonneteers. So whether you're writing a sonnet because your teacher is making you, or because you're just a fan of writing in the form, I'm sure you'll find something here that will suit your fancy. So, up to this point, we've talked about poetic form as it relates to lines. Writing in verse often means setting rules for the lengths of your lines based on the number of syllables and/or stresses. And of course, if that's all unfamiliar to you, the best way to catch up on that would be to watch the videos we've already done where we go into greater depth. But graduating from metrical lines, you'll run into poetic forms that set rules not just for lines, but for an entire poem. And that's different from other kinds of poetry that may have names but don't quite set rules for how you write them. For example, elegies generally talk about mourning and consolation, but they haven't historically had a set form. You recognize an elegy by its content, not its shape. And the same is true with odes, which may have had set forms in their ancient origins, but those rules haven't meaningfully been observed in modern English. But not so with the sonnet. Ask a poet what a sonnet is, and they'll go right to the form, 14 lines of rhyming iambic pentameter. There are some additional complexities that we'll get to in a second, but that's the basic idea. Once you've written a 14-line poem, everyone's sonnet radar is going to go up, and you'll be contending with your reader's sonnet expectations. So a general template for a sonnet might look like this. 14 lines is a must in almost every case. Most typically, those lines will be in iambic pentameter. They will also follow a particular rhyme scheme, and somewhere in there, the sonnet will shift its tone, content, or stance. This shift is usually known as a turn or volta, and it's common in poetry more generally, but it's especially characteristic of the sonnet. So if you've got those things, you've got a sonnet, plain and simple. But like anything that's been around for hundreds of years, you know it's not going to be that plain and simple. I think looking at sonnet variations is kind of interesting for the way that it shows us what can happen when a poetic form developed for one language ends up changing when it's introduced to another one. And for our purposes today, it's enough to say that the sonnet came into English by way of Italian. And that early form is often called the Petrarchan sonnet because it's named after a famous Italian sonnet writer. And Petrarchan sonnets work like this. Of course, we've got 14 lines of iambic pentameter, and the sonnet is broken into two parts. The first 8 lines, called an octave, rhyme A-B-B-A, where all the A words rhyme with each other and all the B words rhyme with each other. The final 6 lines, the sestet, rhyme with 2 C's, 2 D's, and 2 E's in some semi-variable order. C-D-E, C-D-E is common, but you may see C-D-E, D-E-C, or some other kind of twist around. Importantly, the volta, or turn, happens between the octave and sestet. So you'll find some shift in the poem that separates the two parts. When I was in college, a teacher showed us X.J. Kennedy's modern Petrarchan sonnet, Nothing in Heaven Functions as It Ought, which is a charming demonstration of the form and the idea of the volta, which works both in terms of the poem's content and form. But for our public domain purposes, we might look at John Milton's Sonnet 19. Yep, 14 lines, iambs, ABBA, ABBA, CDE, CDE. It all checks out, and the volta happens where you'd expect. The first 8 lines express the speaker's doubts and uncertainties, and the final 6 turn to present affirmation. Petrarchan sonnet complete. But, and now this might surprise you, but Italian and English are not the same language. They're not even built out of the same stuff. Italian's roots in Latin mean that it has all kinds of repeating verb endings and stuff that Germanic English just doesn't have. That is, the Petrarchan sonnet forces you to come up with 4 A rhymes, 4 B rhymes, and then 2 each of C, D, and E rhymes. And this is an easier order to fill in a Romance language than it is in English with its relative lack of rhyming words. So, as the sonnet settled more deeply into the English language, English poets started adjusting the form to its new linguistic home. The English sonnet, sometimes called the Shakespearean sonnet for a reason I'm sure you'll never guess, follows the basic agenda but eases the pressure of rhyming with a greater variety of rhyming words. So, still 14 lines of iambic pentameter, but this time we rhyme A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, G, G, which means that our volta now happens in the final rhyming couplet. So we have less pressure to rhyme, but we add pressure to develop a satisfying turn in only 2 lines rather than 6. Which is to say that you can't really escape the challenge completely, but you can pick the challenge you want. And who else but the copyright-free Shakespeare could we use as an exemplar of the form? We got the lines, we got the rhymes, we got a final couplet that makes the dramatic reveal that the addressee's immortal loveliness is made possible through the immortal lines of poetry. Once again, sonnet complete. And now we could bore ourselves to tears by cataloging every possible variation of the sonnet, but we won't. We'll just talk about 2 more that I like. So if you're looking for an exhaustive academic treatise on the history and variations of the sonnet, I feel compelled to ask why you're looking for that on YouTube. For the rest of us, though, let's just keep having some fun with poems. And to begin, listen, I get it. 14 lines, that's a lot. What do you do when you're a priest with really interesting and wholly idiosyncratic ideas about language and poetry? Well, you write half sonnets, of course, or what Gerard Manley Hopkins called curtal sonnets. Are there many of these in the English language? No, but this is my show, and if I see a chance to get some Hopkins in, you better believe I'm going to take that chance. But I also just think it's an interesting waypoint in our journey to what poets are doing now. See, Hopkins wasn't working in iambic pentameter. He had a theory of what he called sprung rhythm, which scholars have attempted to describe, and I kind of just think it was Hopkins doing his thing. He had a system, it worked for him, and I'm not going to try to explain it because it really just does feel pretty idiosyncratic when you get into it. But anyway, here's a curtal sonnet that he wrote. Hopkins said that a curtal sonnet has 10.5 lines, and you can figure out the math of that half line on your own, but the basic idea is that he's adapting a Petrarchan sonnet. Instead of 8 and 6, we get 6 and 4, and a half, apparently. But we have a meter, just not an iambic one. It's Hopkins' own sprung rhythm, and it rhymes A, B, C, D, E, F, D, E. So this isn't in the strictest sense a sonnet, but it also clearly has its roots in what sonnets do. And while people didn't start writing a bunch of sprung rhythm curtal sonnets, Hopkins did have an influence on modern poets, and his work shows an interesting stage in the loosening of the form over time. That is, the more time the sonnet has spent in English, the more it has adapted to English, losing some of those defining features from its Italian origins. Which then brings us, of course, to contemporary sonnets, which represent probably the greatest loosening of the form. Here, 14 lines and a turn are really our only reliable guideposts. So you might see modern sonnets written in blank verse, or that is without rhymes, or you might get 14 lines that look to be about the length of iambic pentameter but aren't counting syllables at all. And so what happens if you have 14 lines of syllabic verse instead? So purists might say that poems like that aren't sonnets, but they're also clearly inspired by the sonnet. Shakespeare's sonnets are different from Petrarch's, which are different from Spenser's, so where do we draw the line? If a poem only has 14 lines and it looks vaguely sonnetish, readers are still probably going to approach it with some of their sonnet-informed expectations. And then what happens when that poem challenges a reader's expectations for what a sonnet should be? Because we mostly encounter sonnets that are hundreds of years old, we might get the idea that sonnets have to be stuffy, old-fashioned, powdered wig affairs. But what do we do with a sonnet that walks and talks like a product of the 21st century? And is a form that can't adapt to new forms of a language and new artistic movements really that good of a form? These are the kinds of questions new sonnet writers probably have to ask themselves at some point. So is it just about showing that you can keep the rules, or is it about doing something bigger with them, even if that means breaking them? But speaking of doing something bigger, and before we finish up, it would be a shame to talk about sonnets and not talk about crowns of sonnets. They're the great white shark, or whale, or whatever elusive, dangerous, alluring thing hiding out there may be. While the task is kind of big, the idea is fairly simple. For a crown of sonnets, you'll write one sonnet and then another one that begins with the last line of the first. And you'll repeat this process for 7 sonnets where the 7th ends with the first line of the first, closing the loop, or I guess, completing the crown. And that's lovely and all, but what if you doubled it and wrote 14 poems and then used those 14 linking lines to write a 15th sonnet, maybe the crown jewel? That, my friends, would be a stunning achievement in sonnet. But it also sounds like an awful lot of work in a world where there's ice cream to eat, papers to grade, and naps to take. Cobbling together 15 sonnets out of pieces of each other seems like maybe a good activity for retirement, so be sure to like or whatever so that I can retire sooner rather than later. You know what they say, nothing brings in the views quite like sonnets. But really, you've been a great crowd. Whether you're writing a super traditional Petrarchan sonnet or something a little more modern and flexible, I hope we've helped you to find your way into the world of sonnets. Now, thanks for watching, and go have some fun writing sonnets until we meet again.